World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage from the Institute of World Affairs at UWM with the season finale of our World Affairs Roundup. Like nearly every batter who steps up to the presidential plate, Barack Obama has faced a series of foreign policy curveballs. With the 2012 campaign likely to be in full swing in fall, his perceived performance in the global batter's box could help decide whether his administration plays a doubleheader or is sent to the showers. Before they head off to the bleachers for more peanuts and Cracker Jack, our first-string squad of Roundup regulars are here to recap number 44's foreign policy performance so far. Is he ahead in the count or in danger of striking out? Your lineup for today's game includes John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And in left field, Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Executive Director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome back, everyone.
Play ball.
Well, I think much of our discussion will turn on at least the perception of an axis in American foreign policy between the two poles of realism and idealism. Maybe we could start with that. John, what really is involved in these sort of worldviews?
Our viewers are very comfortable with understanding the difference between liberals and conservatives, the right and the left. Foreign policy breaks down somewhat differently between realists, who are much more pragmatic in terms of where our national interests lie, and idealists who work more from a base of values that we think we commonly hold as Americans, or whatever country holds as whatever their values are. We often think of these things as rigid extremes. What happens is that people evolve over time. People move towards being more realistic, depending on the circumstances, or presidents sometimes will react to what their predecessor had done. And in the case of George W. Bush, he was very idealistic in his foreign policy. The early Barack Obama was rather pragmatic and cautious in his foreign policy.
So, Ann, if we look at the Obama administration, where would you say they started out?
Well, as John said, they started out, in what is usually classified as a realist position. There are several examples of this, but what I would highlight is the position on Afghanistan. I mean, he did campaign on the idea that Iraq was the wrong war and Afghanistan was the right war, and he came in and pulled together all sorts of advisors, including the military, to try to decide what to do. And in adopting the surge position, took a position that most people would call realist. So he started out, as John said, very pragmatic, but also consistent with the emphasis on national security, which is usually conceived of in military terms, and less idealist than he might have sounded at times during the campaign.
And Robert, tell us a little bit about the formation of that worldview in Barack Obama's case. I mean, what in his biography do you think led to the position he at least was in at the start of his administration?
Well, and I question somewhat the whole realist-idealist dichotomy in the first place. It was actually created by foreign policy scholars who were realists, who were trying to discredit anyone who thought we could achieve a better world and should base foreign policy on ethics and values. And you needed the expert, the realist, to read the world and say what we should do. But there's obviously elements of realism and idealism. I agree with what John said in all foreign policy. I just don't think there's an idealist camp, really. That's a kind of a caricature created by some realist scholars after World War II. But as far as Barack Obama, the rhetoric itself which I don't mean that in a negative way, I mean as far as public discourse, has grand ideals in it. He talks about having a multilateral world where we have real democracy, where values we all share, basic human rights that are shared, are spread to the whole world. But he's very, even in the discourse, pragmatic about how we get there. He doesn't say we can suddenly change the world like some 18th century utopian foreign policy folks thought you could do. He talks about how we can do it incrementally. There are places where our voice will make impact, but some cases where we can't make immediate progress. And so we are with people who want democracy, who take to the streets, as he has said specifically later in terms of the Arab Spring. But on the other hand, we do not say that we can immediately impose democracy on every country in the world. And so it's a pragmatic kind of idea, but he does try to put ideals and aspirations and the whole idea of America being an example to the world into it as well, and to call for high ideals and to express those ideals.
Well, and John touched on this a little bit earlier. To what extent do you think the administration's foreign policy was in part formed by the second Bush administration? I mean, how much was it a reaction to the perception of their worldview?
Well, he campaigned against George W. Bush's war in Iraq, so in a very real sense it was a reaction to that. But when he got into office, he found that there were the same, he inherited a set of problems that he couldn't just wipe away. And that's, I think, when he saw what those set of problems were, he responded in a realist fashion. I think that over time he's starting to change his positions in significant ways, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's a doctrine, but you can certainly see the change evolving over time.
And what were some of the, I mean, let's talk a little bit about what his foreign policy credentials were when he first took office. I mean, let's look at that resume, John.
Well, he was born in Indonesia. And he was educated in Hawaii, but that's part of the U.S., is it not? And he traveled to Kenya. He didn't have foreign policy credentials when he came in, and I think it was reasonable on his part not to be aggressive, to be cautious. I have a small problem with calling his policy in Afghanistan realistic, because I think it was it was his war as opposed to Bush's war, which was Iraq, and he was going to do that one right. And he's gotten himself into a bit of a quagmire there. I think we generally agree on that.
Well, as we're sort of characterizing his foreign policy, let's take a moment to see how the president characterized it himself. This is a quote from 2007 in which he says, "My foreign policy is actually a return to the traditional bipartisan realistic policy of George Bush's father, of John Kennedy, of, in some ways, Ronald Reagan." So what do we take from that?
It's a good political speech.
Well, he certainly needed to distance himself from the second Bush, right, with his unilateralism, which he specifically has pushed multilateralism with the kind of egotistical foreign policy where we stand alone in the world and do what we want, as opposed to humility, which Barack Obama has a number of times called for, and that's been attacked on the right. And so, but he still wants to say it's a bipartisan foreign policy, so he harkens back to the first Bush, to Reagan to some degree, and to JFK as the ultimate kind of bipartisan foreign policy. It's interesting, though, that when John says he doesn't see Afghanistan as realism, right?
I see it as, no, I see it idealism. Yeah,
I was going to say it's hard to see it as idealism either. That's why the dichotomy doesn't work that well, because in his speeches, President Obama talks about not using force all the time, not over-relying on force, having, moving towards peace over time and less conflict, but then for domestic political considerations, because in order to get out of Iraq, he thought he had to stay strong in Afghanistan, he continues a war that has no clear mission and is not related in any clear way to getting at Al-Qaeda or terrorism. And so it's at odds not only with realism, I would say, but even with the ideals he's been expressing in his speeches. So I think it's a real sore point in his foreign policy. I know withdrawals will start in July, but I don't think history will see this in this war as in a good light at all. It was basically a waste for domestic political reasons.
I think, well, just to defend my characterizing of it as realist, my point is that he was given a number of solutions, possible solutions to the conflict. He chose a military solution, and there were, sending more troops. He didn't choose sending the top number of troops, but close to it. And he explicitly rejected the advice of those who said we should leave right away, pursue a diplomatic solution. We've talked about in previous programs about Richard Holbrooke and his position on it, and he was sort of his position was ignored pretty much. So
which is what?
His position was that we should negotiate with the Taliban. We were only going to have a diplomatic solution to win this war. And of course, he died and he was marginalized in the whole process. So I'm in the sense of thinking of these various possibilities, the fact that realists do tend to emphasize military solutions and do tend to see enemies everywhere to a certain extent. That's the way in which it appears realist to me. But as Robert said, it's always a mix.
But we're jumping across a trench there, and the trench is the Arab Spring. Because the Arab Spring is what caused the evolution in his thinking and his positions. Before that, he had generally sided, and Hillary had sided, with Gates and Donnellan in the National Security Council on a much more realistic foreign policy track. After the Arab Spring, Gates is departing. Hillary shifts to what had been her subordinate's position, which was much more idealistic, as well as Powers and Susan Rice, who were pushing for much greater values-oriented policies. And that caused the speeches that we just recently heard.
So what about the criticism that some have said that, and riffing on Teddy Roosevelt's famous talk softly and carry a big stick, Michael Chase in Foreign Affairs has pointed to criticism where they characterize Obama as speaking often and pretending the stick doesn't exist. Is that a fair criticism, do you think?
I think it's interesting when you read about Obama's foreign policy. You read, he's criticized from all sides. I think he does speak often. I think that the whole perception of his foreign policy now has to be put in the context of the killing of Osama bin Laden, because before that he looked a lot weaker, like he didn't really, and he was hiding behind the Europeans and not hiding, but they were the ones who were in the forefront of the interventions. Now we have the killing of Osama bin Laden makes people see Obama in a different light. And whether that will fade, it probably will fade over time. But right now, I don't think he perceives to, you can't say he doesn't carry a stick after he's killed Osama bin Laden.
Well, we can talk a little bit more in detail about some various situations around the world that may be reflective of that evolution in Obama's foreign policy. But first, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back with more World Affairs Roundup on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to our International Focus and World Affairs Roundup. We're talking about the evolution of Obama's foreign policy. Well, let's talk a little bit about some specifics in various parts of the world. Beginning with Asia, I mean, much of the foreign policy seems to be focused on and driven by what's going on in the Middle East, but Kurt Campbell, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, recently said, I'm quoting here, "We've been on a little bit of a Middle East detour over the course of the last 10 years, and our future will be dominated utterly and fundamentally by developments in Asia and the Pacific region. Now, is that because he runs the Asia and Pacific shop, or do you think that's a legitimate characterization?
Well, Obama started off wanting to redirect our foreign policy to move further towards the Eastern Front, to Asia, because he felt that was more where our long-term interests were. But he just hasn't been able to do it. Partly it's driven because of the amount of resources and attention that Iraq, Afghanistan, and now the Middle East just dominate and require. So you can have assistant secretaries off making their comments because they're all employed, but they don't necessarily generate back and are part of what would be the major points that the president's going to consider, unless something happens.
Well, I mean, that said, there is still a number of strategic interests in that part of the world. Now, Anne, how would you characterize the administration's approach to China and the rest of Asia?
Well, I think obviously they think it's very important, and I think that we have to remember that what's in the news, just because this is the focus of the news and because Obama focuses on some of these issues in his speeches, doesn't mean that the administration isn't taking initiatives in these areas. In fact, Obama has talked about that we need to combine engagement with isolation, different ways of approaching different countries. And right now, there isn't a real crisis in our relation with China, but I'm quite sure that there are a lot of issues that are being discussed on a daily basis and worked on. So I think that we tend to think that the administration is only paying attention to the stories that we see in the news, and we know that that's not true.
We have to be careful when we talk about the president and the administration. They're different animals. The president only can focus on a limited number of areas. The administration can focus on a wide range of things. Now the question becomes what temperature does this rise to in terms of how the president deals with them. And right now Asia is not on, I don't think, is on the president's radar scope.
Well, Robert, let's talk a little bit about Iran, because I think it provides a good example of that tension between sort of more pragmatic approach and an idealistic approach. Obama entered office with a platform of engagement and seeking to have using engagement to try to move forward the nuclear issue. And when the Green Revolution, the uprising in Iran occurred, that created a certain tension about, where does the U.S. fall in supporting it or not, and getting on the wrong side of Tehran, did it not?
Well, it does. It reflects that tension we've been talking about in the show. We've talked about it in previous episodes. That he wanted to break with the Bush administration, which just wanted to, pillory Iran as part of the axis of evil, and beat them into submission without being able, of course, to have another ground war in the Middle East at the same time. And so he thought he wanted to have some kind of engagement, and therefore he was reluctant, once the Green Revolution started, to speak out immediately. And so he was seen as tepid by a number of people, and certainly a lot of people involved in the streets of Tehran felt that way. But as we've moved along, and as it becomes clear that the Ahmadinejad regime is not that workable, and that the atrocities are as outrageous as the others across the Middle East that tyrants have done during popular uprisings, he has become gradually more and more likely to speak towards those popular aspirations, and has tied it rhetorically to what's happened in Tunisia, what has happened in Egypt, what has happened in Yemen, etc. So it's sort of, he's come back around on the narrative, and I think John's right that his discourse about Iran is very different now with the experience and also with what happened in the Arab Spring than it was before, but expresses that tension. At some point, one of the major tensions in foreign policy is order versus democracy, right? And Obama has said very eloquently that sometimes tyranny creates less order long term because it's not legitimate government, and there are huge uprisings later. But at the same time, you can't take on yourself every tyrannical regime in the world all at the same time. So sometimes you pull your punches, but then that makes you seem like you're hypocritical and contradictory. So it's very hard to pursue a values-based foreign policy. He has tried to say that in most cases he's doing it rhetorically, which is powerful. That does, I know people say it's mere rhetoric, but that does have a huge impact on people throughout the world when the President of the United States supports their aspirations. And so that matters a lot. He has suggested, I think it's interesting in his Middle East speech recently, that we're with you whenever you go forward and start to do it yourself. In other words, it's not our obligation to go and overthrow a tyrannical regime, but if the people start to take the issue into their own hands, then we'll be behind you. Of course, when we're going to be behind you is a question. Iran brings that up since we were not immediately there, but we were later. I think that that's inevitable in a complicated foreign policy when you're balancing interests and order with democratic aspirations. There's not one doctrine or rule you can apply to every situation. And that is his doctrine, if there is a doctrine.
And another good illustration of that point, I think, is Egypt. Walk us through sort of the administration's relationship with Mubarak during the Egyptian situation.
Well, in the beginning, they were very, very, very cautious, coming out and saying that they were behind Mubarak, and then they were behind the vice president who had been appointed. And it was, I think it was about a week into the protest that finally Obama came out and said he has to go. And that was it was interesting to watch it unfold, particularly because they sent a former ambassador, Frank Wisner, to speak to Mubarak, a friend of Mubarak's, to tell him in private that he had to go. And then a few days later, Frank Wisner was on a video conference saying that Mubarak had to stay, and that was the sign of that was key to stability there in the Middle East. The administration was caught here because they were criticized very, very strongly by a number of Middle East allies for deserting their ally of a number of years, and it was very problematic with Israel. And I mean, so you can see the tension right there.
My argument with this process, and Egypt's a good case in point, is we're simplifying this down. We use code words like democracy and liberty when we have no idea what the people are who are espousing that, or who we say are espousing that. And we're forgetting that in the Middle East, in this Arab Spring, the rapid increase in the cost of foodstuffs, 20% plus, had an enormous impact on why people were rising up against their governments. Three, we have no plan. We're just leaping along. We have no idea where this is going. We're now talking about throwing $1 billion or more money into this area. Where's this money coming from? I mean, we're in financial trouble, and we're taking on more adventures in the world.
Well, that's why I'm disappointed in Afghanistan. If we would have a less military response, where a military solution doesn't really exist, we'd have more resources to do things such as deal with global warming, deal with a global poverty and food crisis. We could actually do that much more cost effectively, and, by the way, still afford Medicare and things like that in our country. So I think that, but I think it's a declining power. I think we need to take that into account.
Well, one of the sort of background issues in all of this is the role of the U.S. as a global actor. And people have argued one of the complicating factors in the administration's conduct of foreign policy is there really has been sort of a tectonic shift in the relations between countries, among which are the relative decline of the U.S. Now, it was interesting in that regard to listen to the President's remarks in London before Parliament, in which he seemed to articulate that despite everything that's gone on, there is still sort of a special role for the U.S. and the UK. Could you talk a little bit about that, Ann?
Yeah, he went through a lot of the history of the relationship between the two countries, but he did, I noticed it too, that he, whereas before he had talked about working through allies, somebody talked about it, referring to it as leading from behind, he really asserted the important leadership role of the U.S. as well as Britain, saying things like, if we don't do it, nobody else will, and of course emphasizing the need for cooperation with the British, but also reasserting that special role for the United States. It's really hard in these speeches to figure out, you know, when we talked earlier about the 2007 speech and his invocation of George H.W. Bush. I mean, it's campaign speak. And here, you know, he's before the Parliament, and you sort of have to read the tea leaves, as they say, to try and figure out what's going on and where the threads are.
Well, you know, we're running out of time, and I want to get to sort of the bottom line question. First of all, we saw in the midterm elections, foreign policy played virtually no role. Will it be a factor in 2012? And assuming it is, will the conduct of foreign policy on the part of the administration to date help or hurt? I'll just throw that open to everyone.
Barring a terrorist attack or any major mishap in withdrawing from Afghanistan, it'll be mildly positive because of the assassination of bin Laden, but it will not be the dominant factor in the midterms.
No, I think they will. I agree. I think that they will, if they will try to use the Osama bin Laden killing to their advantage in the campaign, but if things are still drawn out in Libya and if Afghanistan is still a mess, on balance, it may even prove to be negative.
Last few seconds go to you, John.
I would say economics will define the foreign policy connection, and there are lots of things out there that are unraveling in the Eurozone and in relations with China over economic issues that could enter into the campaign.
Well, to each of you, thank you very much for another season of penetrating punditry, and to our viewers, don't forget your sunscreen, and we'll see you back in fall for more International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220, or visit us at our website,